Sometimes the most powerful moments in our lives happen when no one is watching, when there are no cameras, no witnesses, no recognition waiting at the end. Just a choice between walking away or doing what's right. This is the story of Jake Martinez, a single father working the night shift as a janitor at one of Manhattan's most prestigious financial firms. Every night, he moves through glass offices and marble hallways like a ghost, cleaning up after people who earn more in a month than he makes in a year. People who pass him in the corridors without a second glance, as if he were part of the furniture. Jake never expected to be noticed. He never expected his world to collide with that of Sarah Mitchell, the firm's CEO, a woman whose decisions move markets and whose presence commands every room she enters. Two people from completely different universes, living in the same building, but existing in parallel realities that should never intersect. But on one December night, after the company's annual holiday party, something happened that would shatter those invisible barriers forever. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. on a Friday night in Midtown Manhattan. The streets glisten with a light drizzle, reflecting the neon lights of a city that never truly sleeps. Inside the 42nd floor of the Meridian Financial Building, the remnants of an elegant corporate celebration lie scattered across conference rooms. Empty champagne glasses, forgotten name tags, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with catered hors d'oeuvres. Jake pushes his cleaning cart through the hallways, his worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished marble floors. His shift started at midnight, as it does every weeknight, and won't end until 8 a.m. Then he'll rush home to wake up his 7-year-old daughter Emma, make her breakfast, walk her to school, and try to catch a few hours of sleep before starting all over again. This has been his routine for 3 years now, ever since his wife left them for a life she said held more promise than being married to a man who lacked ambition. Jake never saw it as lacking ambition. He saw it as doing whatever it took to provide for his daughter, even if it meant swallowing his pride and accepting a job that others might consider beneath them. Tonight feels different, though. There's an electricity in the air, a tension he can't quite place. Maybe it's because he caught glimpses of the party earlier, the executives in their designer suits, the flowing evening gowns, the laughter that echoed through corridors he's only ever seen empty and silent. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to belong to that world, to be seen as more than just the invisible man who empties their trash cans. As Jake rounds the corner toward the executive wing, he stops. Something's wrong. The lights in the CEO's office are still on, and he can hear, "Is that crying?" Now, you might think this is where I tell you Jake simply minded his own business and continued with his work. After all, that would be the safe thing to do, the smart thing. When you're a single father living paycheck to paycheck, you don't take risks that might jeopardize the only job that puts food on your table and keeps a roof over your daughter's head. But Jake Martinez wasn't built that way. Despite everything life had thrown at him, despite the way society had taught him to stay invisible, there was still something inside him that couldn't ignore another person's pain. Even when that person lived in a world so far removed from his own that they might as well have been on different planets. What Jake discovered when he approached that office door would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and the invisible lines that separate us. It would force him to make a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed as a man, trying to raise his daughter alone in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And what happened the next day? Well, let's just say that sometimes the most unexpected words can come from the most unexpected places, changing two lives in ways neither person could have imagined. This is a story about the moments that define us, about the choice between self-preservation and compassion, about how a single act of kindness from someone who had every reason to look the other way could transform not just one life, but two. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear will remind you that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, choosing to help others even when they're barely keeping their own heads above water. To understand what happened that night, you need to know who Jake Martinez really was, beneath the uniform and the invisible status society had assigned him. Jake hadn't always been a janitor. 5 years earlier, he'd been an assistant manager at a small community bank in Queens, with dreams of working his way up through the financial world. He had a degree in business administration from Queens College, earned through night classes while working 2 jobs to support his young family. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. When Emma was born with a heart condition that required expensive treatments, Jake's health insurance barely covered the basics. The medical bills piled up faster than his modest salary could handle. Then his wife, Maria, began to resent the long hours, the financial stress, the way their life seemed to be moving backward instead of forward. "You're settling," she told him one evening as Emma slept in her crib, her small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone fighting just to breathe normally. "We're drowning, Jake, and you're too proud to admit it." When Maria left, she took more than just her belongings. She took Jake's confidence, his belief that hard work and good intentions were enough to build a life on. The bank job that had once felt like a stepping stone to something bigger suddenly felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Emma needed more surgeries, more specialists, more everything than his insurance and salary could provide. So Jake did what any father would do. He made a choice. The night shift at Meridian Financial paid twice what his bank job offered, plus comprehensive health benefits that covered Emma's treatments without question. It didn't matter that he'd gone from wearing suits and sitting in meetings to wearing coveralls and emptying trash cans. What mattered was that his daughter could get the care she needed. Every night, as Jake moved through those pristine offices, he wasn't just cleaning, he was absorbing. He read the financial reports left on desks, studied the market analyses pinned to bulletin boards, listened to the conversations of late-working executives who spoke as if he weren't there. In his mind, he was still the man who'd once had ambitions beyond these walls, even if his circumstances had forced him to set those dreams aside. The irony wasn't lost on him that he probably understood the company's business better than half the junior executives who looked through him as if he were invisible. But understanding and belonging were 2 very different things, and Jake had learned to accept his place in the hierarchy of this glass and steel world. Emma was his why, his reason for swallowing his pride every single night. At 7 years old, she was his entire universe, bright, curious, and blissfully unaware of the sacrifices her father made to keep her healthy and happy. She thought Daddy worked at the big, shiny building, and that was exciting enough for her. She didn't need to know that Daddy was invisible there, that he existed in the margins of other people's important lives. On this particular December night, Jake had watched the annual holiday party from the service elevators and back hallways, catching glimpses of a world that glittered with possibility. He'd seen Sarah Mitchell from a distance before, of course. She was impossible to miss when she walked through the office, her presence commanding attention from everyone except the cleaning staff, who were trained to become even more invisible when executives were around. Sarah Mitchell was what people called a self-made success story, though Jake often wondered if anyone was truly self-made or if some people just had better starting points than others. At 38, she'd climbed from a junior analyst position to CEO in just 15 years, earning a reputation as someone who could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. She was brilliant, demanding, and reportedly fair, though Jake had never been in a position to verify that last part personally. What Jake didn't know, what no one at the company knew, was that Sarah's success had come at a cost that was becoming harder to ignore. The higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. The more she achieved, the more people related to her title rather than her humanity. The party that night had been a perfect example. Hundreds of people celebrating with her, but no one really seeing her. As Jake approached the executive wing, his cleaning cartwheels rolling quietly across the marble floor, he could hear it more clearly now. The unmistakable sound of someone crying. Not the dramatic sobbing you might expect from a movie, but the raw, exhausted weeping of someone who thought they were completely alone. Jake stopped, his hand tightening on the cart handle. Every instinct told him to turn around, to respect the privacy of whoever was behind that door. But there was something about the sound that reminded him of himself on those nights when Emma was in the hospital, when he'd step into the hallway so she wouldn't see him fall apart. He knocked softly on the doorframe. The crying stopped immediately. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but are you okay?" There was a long silence. Then Sarah's voice, strained and trying to regain its usual authority. "Who is that?" "Jake Martinez, Ma'am, from the cleaning crew. I heard. I wanted to make sure you weren't hurt or anything." Another silence. Jake could imagine her debating whether to maintain the facade or acknowledge what he'd witnessed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, more human than he'd ever heard it. "I'm fine. You can continue with your work." But Jake didn't move. There was something in her tone that reminded him too much of his own attempts to convince Emma that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but would you like me to call someone? A friend or family member? Sometimes it helps to have someone." "There isn't anyone to call." The words came out before Sarah could stop them, raw and honest and more revealing than she'd intended. Jake understood that feeling intimately. He looked around the hallway, then made a decision that would change both their lives. He stepped into the doorway, not fully entering her office but making himself visible. Sarah looked up from her desk, where she sat surrounded by the detritus of a successful career. Awards, photos with important people, expensive decorations that spoke of achievement, but not of connection. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her carefully styled hair disheveled. For the first time, Jake saw her not as the intimidating CEO, but as a person who was struggling with something heavy and painful. "I know we don't know each other," Jake said carefully, "and I know this isn't my place. But sometimes when Emma, that's my daughter, sometimes when she's scared or sad, she just needs someone to sit with her. Not to fix anything or say the right words, just to not be alone." Sarah stared at him, this man she'd probably passed in the hallways 1,000 times without truly seeing. There was something in his eyes that was free of judgment, free of the careful political calculations that colored every other interaction in her professional life. "Why would you—" she began, then stopped. "You don't even know what's wrong." Jake leaned against the doorframe, his uniform marking him as someone who didn't belong in this space, yet somehow his presence felt more genuine than anything Sarah had experienced in months. "My wife left me 3 years ago," he said simply. "Told me I wasn't ambitious enough, that I was settling for less than I deserved. Tonight, watching that party, seeing all those people in their expensive clothes talking about their important lives, I wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I'm just the invisible guy who empties the trash cans." Sarah found herself listening not just to his words, but to the vulnerability behind them. Here was someone who had every reason to resent her world, yet was offering kindness without expecting anything in return. "But then I think about Emma," Jake continued, "and I realize that maybe being invisible isn't the worst thing. Maybe what matters isn't whether people see you, but whether you see them. Whether you show up when someone needs you to." For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen by someone who wanted nothing from her except to offer comfort to another human being. The conversation that followed would last until dawn. Two people from different worlds, discovering that pain and hope and the search for meaning are universal languages that transcend the boundaries society creates. When Jake finally left that office, as the sun began to rise over Manhattan and cast long shadows across the marble floors, Both he and Sarah had been changed by an encounter that should never have happened according to the rules of their respective worlds. But what Sarah said to him the next day, that would be the moment that transformed understanding into action, gratitude into opportunity, and two separate lives into a story that would ripple far beyond the walls of that 42nd floor. The following morning brought a different kind of tension to the Meridian Financial Building. Jake arrived home just as Emma was waking up, her sleepy smile the same ray of sunshine that had motivated him through 3 years of night shifts. As he helped her get ready for school, making breakfast and packing her lunch, he couldn't shake the surreal quality of the previous night. Had he really spent 4 hours talking with Sarah Mitchell, the CEO whose name appeared on plaques throughout the building? Had she really shared stories about her childhood in rural Montana, her struggles to be taken seriously in boardrooms full of men who questioned every decision she made? Had he really told her about Emma's heart condition, about the nights he'd fallen asleep in hospital chairs, about the way Maria's leaving had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself? The conversation had felt like stepping into an alternate reality where titles and uniforms didn't matter, where two people could connect over the universal experiences of loneliness, responsibility, and the weight of carrying other people's expectations. But in the harsh light of a December morning in Queens, as Jake walked Emma to school and listened to her chatter about her upcoming Christmas pageant, he wondered if the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate dream. Emma tugged on his hand as they reached the school entrance. "Daddy, you seem different today. Happy different." Jake knelt down to her level, adjusting her pink backpack and smoothing down a rebellious curl. "Just thinking about some things, sweetheart. Have a good day at school, okay? Are you still sad about Mommy not being here for Christmas?" The question hit Jake unexpectedly. Emma rarely mentioned Maria anymore, having adapted to their life together with the resilience that children possess. But the holidays always brought reminders of what their family used to look like, of the woman who had once helped decorate their small apartment and bake cookies that filled their home with warmth. "Sometimes I am sad about that," Jake admitted, because he'd learned that honesty, delivered gently, was better than false reassurances. "But you know what makes me happy? Getting to spend Christmas with the most amazing little girl in the world." Emma beamed and threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Em. More than all the stars in the sky." As Jake walked back to their apartment, he felt the familiar ache of exhaustion settling into his bones. He had maybe 5 hours to sleep before he needed to pick Emma up from school, help her with homework, make dinner, and get ready for another night shift. This was his routine, his carefully constructed life that revolved around Emma's needs and the demands of a job that kept them financially stable. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of their small bedroom, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's words from the night before. She had talked about feeling trapped by her own success, about how the higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. She'd mentioned her ex-husband, who had left her for someone less complicated, someone who didn't bring work stress home every night. "We're both running from different kinds of loneliness," she had said, as the Manhattan skyline began to lighten outside her office windows. "You're invisible because society has decided you don't matter. I'm invisible because I matter too much. People only see my position, never me." Jake had found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, not even his closest friends. He talked about the nights when Emma was asleep, and he'd sit at their small kitchen table, reading business journals and dreaming of a different life. He'd admitted that he sometimes felt guilty for wanting more when he should be grateful for what he had. "Ambition isn't a dirty word," Sarah had told him. "Your wife was wrong about that." But maybe she was wrong about what ambition looks like. Maybe taking care of your daughter, sacrificing your own dreams to make sure she has everything she needs. Maybe that takes more courage than chasing a corner office. Now, lying in bed as the morning sun filtered through his apartment's thin curtains, Jake wondered what would happen when he saw her again. Would she acknowledge what had happened, or would they both pretend it was just an anomaly, a moment of weakness that should never be repeated? He didn't have to wait long to find out. Jake's phone rang at 2 p.m., jolting him from the few hours of sleep he'd managed to grab. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer anyway. "Mr. Martinez, this is Linda Chen, executive assistant to Sarah Mitchell at Meridian Financial. Ms. Mitchell would like to see you in her office today at 4 p.m. Should I confirm your attendance?" Jake sat up in bed, his heart suddenly racing. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I work the night shift." "I don't usually." "There's no mistake, Mr. Martinez. Ms. Mitchell specifically requested to meet with you this afternoon. She said to tell you it's about your conversation last night." Jake looked at his alarm clock. He had an hour to shower, get dressed, and somehow make it to Manhattan. More importantly, he had an hour to figure out whether this meeting was about to end his employment or change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Mr. Martinez, are you there?" "Yes," Jake said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Yes, I'll be there." After hanging up, Jake stared at his phone for a long moment. He thought about calling in sick to work, about pretending the whole thing had never happened. But something Sarah had said the night before echoed in his mind. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. Jake showered quickly and put on the only dress shirt he owned, a blue button-down he'd bought for Emma's school concerts. As he rode the subway into Manhattan, watching the familiar progression from working-class neighborhoods to gleaming office towers, he tried to prepare himself for every possible scenario. Maybe Sarah regretted their conversation and wanted to make sure he understood the boundaries between their professional relationship. Maybe she was concerned about confidentiality and needed him to sign some kind of agreement. Maybe she had decided that someone who had seen her vulnerable was too much of a liability to keep around. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. Jake had been in this elevator hundreds of times, but always late at night when the building was mostly empty. Now, at 4 p.m. on a weekday, it was filled with people in expensive suits, carrying leather briefcases, and talking into phones about deals and deadlines and decisions that moved money around the world. Jake caught his reflection in the elevator's polished walls and felt suddenly conscious of how out of place he looked. His shirt was clean but clearly off the rack. His shoes were comfortable but worn, and no amount of effort could make him look like he belonged in this world of manicured success. When the elevator opened on the executive floor, Linda Chen was waiting for him. She was a small, efficient-looking woman in her 50s who had been Sarah's assistant for over a decade. "Mr. Martinez, please follow me." Jake had cleaned Linda's office many times, but he'd never seen it from this perspective, as someone who was supposed to be there during business hours. The space looked different in daylight, more imposing somehow. The modern art on the walls, the fresh flowers on the reception desk, the expensive furniture that spoke of a budget he couldn't fathom. "Ms. Mitchell will see you now," Linda said, opening the door to Sarah's office. Jake stepped inside, and for a moment he was disoriented by how different the space looked in the afternoon light. The night before, it had been lit by desk lamps and the glow of the city outside, creating an intimate atmosphere that had made their conversation feel natural, almost inevitable. Now, with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the noise of the city muted 42 floors below, the office looked like what it was: the command center of someone who wielded enormous power and influence. Sarah stood up from her desk as he entered. She was wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Jake made in a month, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked every inch the successful CEO, nothing like the vulnerable woman who had cried in this same office 12 hours earlier. For a moment, Jake wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. "Jake," she said, and her use of his first name surprised him. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, but instead of returning to her executive chair, she moved to the chair beside his. The gesture was small but significant, a signal that this conversation would happen between equals, not between a CEO and a janitor. I want to start by thanking you for last night, Sarah said. What you did, staying with me, listening without judgment, it meant more than you could possibly know. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ma'am, you don't need to thank me. Anyone would have. No, Sarah interrupted gently. That's where you're wrong. Anyone wouldn't have. In fact, hundreds of people wouldn't have and haven't over the years. You saw someone in pain and you chose to help, even though it wasn't your job, even though it could have gotten you in trouble. That says something about who you are. Jake looked down at his hands, unsure how to respond to praise he felt he didn't deserve. I've been thinking about our conversation all day, Sarah continued, about the things you said, about your daughter, about the choices you've made. And I've been thinking about something you mentioned, how you sometimes feel like you're settling for less than you deserve. Ms. Mitchell, I didn't mean to suggest that this job isn't... Jake. She leaned forward slightly, her expression intense but kind. I looked at your file this morning. Did you know that when you applied here 3 years ago, you submitted a resume that was completely overqualified for a janitorial position? Business degree, management experience, excellent references. Most HR departments would have thrown it away, assuming you wouldn't stay long. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks. He had hoped no one would notice the disconnect between his background and his current position. But our HR manager at the time, Janet Rodriguez, made a note in your file. She wrote, "This man is choosing this job for a reason. That kind of dedication to family deserves our respect." That's why you were hired, Jake, not because you were qualified to empty trash cans, but because you were overqualified and chose to do it anyway. Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. I've spent the last 15 years climbing this corporate ladder, stepping on people, making hard choices, telling myself that success justifies almost anything. And where has it gotten me? Crying alone in my office at 2 a.m. because I can't remember the last time someone asked how I was doing without wanting something from me. She turned back to face him. You know what struck me most about our conversation last night? You didn't want anything from me. You weren't trying to network or impress me or get something out of the encounter. You just saw another human being who was hurting and you chose to help. Jake felt increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate what you're saying, but I have a proposition for you, Sarah said, returning to her chair. Our junior analyst program is starting a new cohort in January. It's designed for people with business backgrounds who want to transition into finance. The salary is 3 times what you're making now, with full benefits, education assistance, and a clear path for advancement. Jake stared at her, certain he had misheard. I'm sorry, what? I want to offer you a position in our analyst program. You'd start at the bottom of the corporate ladder, but it would be the bottom of a different ladder. One that leads somewhere you actually want to go. The room seemed to spin around Jake. He tried to process what she was saying, but it felt too enormous, too impossible to be real. Ms. Mitchell, I can't accept that. People would think, they'd assume that I got the job because of last night, because you what? Because you showed kindness to someone who needed it. Because you demonstrated character when no one was watching. Sarah's voice was firm but not unkind. Jake, I've been in business long enough to know the difference between favoritism and recognizing potential. This isn't charity. This is me offering a qualified candidate an opportunity that matches his skills and ambition. But I don't have experience in finance. I've been cleaning offices for 3 years. You've been cleaning offices, yes, but you've also been absorbing everything around you. I asked Janet to pull the security footage from last month. Do you know what I saw? You straightening papers on desks, organizing files that had been left messy, even fixing errors in reports that were left open on computers. You weren't just cleaning, Jake. You were learning. Jake felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. The idea that someone had noticed, that his invisible efforts had been seen, was almost overwhelming. "I need to think about Emma," he said finally. "The night shift works with her schedule. I don't know how I'd handle school pickups, and we have an excellent corporate childcare center on the 15th floor, Sarah said. Emma could come here after school, do her homework, eat dinner. You'd see more of her, not less." For a moment, Jake allowed himself to imagine it. Walking into this building in a suit instead of coveralls. Sitting in meetings instead of emptying trash cans. Being seen, being heard, being valued for his mind instead of being invisible. But with the excitement came fear. What if he failed? What if he wasn't smart enough, polished enough, connected enough to succeed in this world? What if accepting this opportunity was just setting himself up for a bigger fall? "You're scared," Sarah observed, reading his expression. "Good. If you weren't scared, it would mean you weren't taking this seriously." "What if I don't fit in? What if I can't do the job?" Sarah smiled, and Jake saw a glimpse of the woman from the night before, not the polished executive, but the human being underneath. "Jake, last night you did something that most people in this building couldn't do. You looked past someone's title and status and saw them as a person. You offered help without expecting anything in return. You listened without trying to fix or judge or gain advantage. Those are the rarest skills in business, and they can't be taught." She leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm not offering you this job because I feel sorry for you or because I owe you something for last night. I'm offering it because I've seen your character, and character is the foundation everything else is built on. The technical skills can be learned. The degree of caring you showed last night, that's something you either have or you don't." Jake sat in silence for a long moment, wrestling with fears and hopes that seemed too big for his chest to contain. He thought about Emma, about the opportunities this could create for her future. He thought about Maria and how she had called him unambitious. He thought about all the nights he'd dreamed of something more while emptying wastebaskets and mopping floors. "If I say yes," he said slowly, "when would I start?" "January 3rd. That gives you 2 weeks to transition out of your current position and spend the holidays with Emma. The program starts with 2 weeks of intensive training, then you'd be assigned to a team." "And if I fail?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Jake, I've been in business for 15 years, and I've learned that there are 2 kinds of failure. There's the failure that comes from not trying, and the failure that comes from giving your best effort to something worthwhile. The first kind destroys you, the second kind teaches you." She stood up and extended her hand. "I believe in taking chances on people who have shown me who they really are when they thought no one was watching. You showed me last night that you're someone worth taking a chance on." Jake looked at her outstretched hand, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The years of struggle, the nights of exhaustion, the dreams he'd thought were dead, the kindness he'd shown without expecting anything in return. He stood up and shook her hand. "I accept," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd known of her existence, Jake saw her not as an intimidating figure of authority, but as someone who understood what it meant to take risks, to bet on yourself when the odds weren't clear. "Welcome to Meridian Financial, Mr. Martinez. I have a feeling you're going to surprise a lot of people." As Jake left her office, his mind spinning with the magnitude of what had just happened, he realized that Sarah had been wrong about one thing. The person who was most surprised was him. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt different this time. Jake wasn't thinking about how out of place he looked among the business suits and designer handbags. He was thinking about Emma's face when he told her that Daddy would be working in the big, shiny building during the day now, that she could visit him after school, that their life was about to change in ways they'd both dreamed about but never dared to expect. He was thinking about calling his mother in San Antonio to tell her that her faith in him hadn't been misplaced. He was thinking about the business courses he'd always wanted to take, the skills he'd always wanted to develop, the career he'd thought was impossible for someone like him. Most of all, he was thinking about the conversation that had started it all. Two people from different worlds, sitting in an office at dawn, discovering that human connection transcends every boundary society tries to create. As Jake walked out of the Meridian Financial Building into the crisp December afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just the desperate hope of someone trying to survive, but the confident hope of someone who had been given a chance to thrive. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation and nervous excitement. Jake gave his 2 weeks' notice to the night shift supervisor, who seemed genuinely happy for him despite losing a reliable employee. He spent his final nights at Meridian Financial, looking at the building through different eyes, seeing not just a place where he cleaned, but a place where he would soon work alongside the people whose offices he had maintained. Christmas morning brought its own magic. Emma squealed with delight at the modest gifts under their small tree, but Jake's greatest gift was being able to tell her that their lives were about to change. He didn't overwhelm her with details about corporate hierarchies or career advancement. He simply told her that Daddy had gotten a new job that would let him spend more time with her. "Will you still wear your uniform?" Emma asked, playing with the new art supplies Jake had managed to afford thanks to his final night shift paycheck. "No, sweetheart. I'll wear nice clothes like the people you see in the lobby when we visit the building." Emma's eyes widened. "Like a businessman?" "Like a businessman," Jake confirmed, still adjusting to the idea himself. The first day of the analyst program arrived faster than Jake was ready for. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., adjusting the tie he'd practiced knotting dozens of times, trying to convince himself that he belonged in the navy suit he'd bought with his last week's wages. The man looking back at him still felt like Jake Martinez, single father from Queens, but he was dressed like someone who belonged in the world he was about to enter. The training program was intensive and intimidating. Jake found himself in a conference room with 11 other analysts, most of them fresh out of prestigious business schools, all of them fluent in financial jargon that he had to work twice as hard to understand. There was Jennifer, who had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, Michael, whose father ran a hedge fund in Connecticut, and Lisa, who spoke 3 languages and had interned at Goldman Sachs. For the first few days, Jake felt like an imposter waiting to be discovered. While his classmates discussed their previous internships and networking connections, Jake quietly absorbed everything, taking notes with the intensity of someone who knew this opportunity might never come again. But gradually, something interesting began to happen. The very experiences that made Jake feel different from his classmates also gave him advantages they didn't possess. When they analyzed case studies about operational efficiency, Jake could speak from experience about how small changes in workplace procedures affected the people who actually did the work. When they discussed customer service strategies, Jake understood both sides. He'd been the invisible service provider and the customer who needed help. Most importantly, Jake's years of careful observation served him well. He had learned to read people, to notice details others missed, to understand the human dynamics that drove business decisions. While his classmates focused on spreadsheets and algorithms, Jake saw the stories behind the numbers. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week of training. The group was working on a case study about employee retention in service industries. While his classmates proposed typical solutions, higher wages, better benefits, more vacation time, Jake raised his hand. "I think we're missing something important," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Most of these proposals assume that people leave jobs just because of money or benefits. But sometimes people leave because they feel invisible, because they don't feel valued or seen by the organization. The room fell silent. Jake could feel his classmates' attention shifting to him, some curious, others skeptical. "Can you elaborate on that?" asked Dr. Richards, the program director. Jake took a breath, thinking about his years of night shifts, his observations of how the day staff interacted differently than the cleaning crew. "When I was in my previous position," Jake said carefully, "I noticed the turnover was highest among employees who felt like their work didn't matter to anyone above them in the hierarchy. It wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about basic recognition, about feeling like their contributions were seen and valued." He went on to describe specific examples he'd witnessed, talking about the security guard who quit not because of his salary, but because no one had acknowledged his 20 years of service, or the cafeteria worker who left after management implemented new policies without asking for input from the people who would have to execute them. When Jake finished speaking, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Jennifer leaned forward. "That's actually brilliant," she said. "We've been looking at this from a purely economic perspective, but you're talking about human psychology." Dr. Richards nodded approvingly. "Jake's perspective highlights something we often overlook in business school, the human element. Numbers tell us what happened, but they don't always tell us why." From that day forward, Jake's classmates began to see him differently. He wasn't just the older guy who had somehow gotten into the program. He was someone who brought a unique and valuable perspective to their discussions. They started seeking out his input, incorporating his insights into their team projects. Jake's confidence grew with each passing day. He discovered that his years of absorbing information while working had given him a broader understanding of the company's operations than most entry-level analysts possessed. He could explain how decisions made in the executive suite affected people throughout the organization, because he'd seen those effects firsthand. 3 months into the program, Jake was assigned to a team analyzing potential cost-saving measures for the company's facilities management. It was the kind of project that would normally result in recommendations to outsource services or reduce staff. Standard corporate efficiency plays that looked good on paper, but often had human costs that weren't reflected in the financial projections. Jake's team was preparing their final presentation when he asked to schedule a meeting with the team leader, a senior analyst named Robert Chen. Linda's nephew, Jake learned, continuing the family tradition of excellence at Meridian Financial. "I have some concerns about our recommendations," Jake said as they sat in Robert's office. Robert looked up from his laptop, slightly impatient. "The numbers are solid, Jake. We can save the company significant money with these efficiencies." "I'm not questioning the numbers," Jake said. "I'm questioning whether we understand the full cost of implementing these changes." Jake opened his folder and pulled out a detailed analysis he'd prepared on his own time. "I've been looking at the proposals from the perspective of the people who would be affected. If we outsource janitorial services, we save money on paper, but we lose institutional knowledge. The current cleaning staff knows the building, knows which areas need special attention, knows how to work around the business operations without disrupting them." He pointed to specific line items in their report. "If we reduce the cleaning schedule from nightly to 3 times per week, we save on labor costs, but we create health and safety risks that could result in much larger costs down the line. And if we eliminate the building's childcare center to convert it to additional office space, we might gain rental income, but we'll lose employees who depend on that service." Robert was listening now, his impatience replaced by genuine interest. "More importantly," Jake continued, "these changes send a message to employees about what the company values. When you make decisions that affect people's livelihoods without considering the human impact, you create a culture where people feel disposable. That affects productivity, loyalty, and ultimately, profitability. Jake had spent weeks preparing alternative recommendations that achieved similar cost savings through different means, efficiency improvements rather than service cuts, technology upgrades that enhanced rather than replaced human workers, policy changes that saved money while improving working conditions. "This is impressive work," Robert said, reviewing Jake's analysis. "But why didn't you bring this up during our team meetings?" Jake hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because I was afraid you'd think I was being emotional rather than analytical. I was afraid my perspective would be dismissed as biased." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with new respect. "You know, we spend so much time learning how to analyze businesses from the outside that we sometimes forget the value of understanding them from the inside. Your perspective isn't biased, it's informed." The final presentation included both sets of recommendations, with Jake presenting the alternative approach. The senior executives in the room, including Sarah, who maintained her professional demeanor while Jake spoke, asked probing questions that demonstrated they understood the value of his insights. 2 weeks later, the company implemented a modified version of Jake's recommendations, saving money while actually improving working conditions for facilities staff. Robert made sure Jake received full credit for the innovative approach, and word began to spread throughout the company about the analyst who brought a unique perspective to problem solving. But the real transformation was happening in Jake himself. With each successful project, each moment of recognition, each day that he walked into the building wearing a suit instead of coveralls, Jake was rediscovering parts of himself that had been dormant for years. The intellectual curiosity that had driven him through college, the leadership skills he'd developed in his banking job, the confidence that came from knowing his ideas had value, all of it was returning. Stronger than before because it was now tempered by experience and empathy. Emma noticed the change too. When Jake picked her up from the childcare center each evening, she would chatter about her day while he gathered his things from his desk. His desk, in his cubicle, in his department, where his nameplate read, Jake Martinez, Junior Analyst, and his computer screen showed projects that would influence real decisions affecting real people. "Daddy, Tommy's dad works in an office too, but he doesn't seem as happy as you do," Emma observed one evening as they walked to the subway. Jake squeezed her hand. "What makes you think I'm happy, sweetheart? You smile more now, and you don't have that worried look you used to get when you thought I wasn't watching." Out of the mouths of babes. Jake realized that Emma was right. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined his life for years was gradually fading. Not because their lives were perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving towards something rather than just trying to survive each day. 6 months into his new position, Jake was promoted to associate analyst, with a salary increase that allowed him to move into a better apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. Emma's delight at having her own bedroom was infectious, and Jake found himself thinking about possibilities he'd long ago stopped considering. Maybe someday buying a small house, maybe taking Emma on a real vacation, maybe even dating again when he felt ready to trust someone with their carefully rebuilt life. The promotion also brought new responsibilities, including mentoring incoming analysts. Jake found himself in the position of helping people who reminded him of his former self, talented but uncertain, capable but lacking confidence, full of potential but needing someone to believe in them. One of his mentees was Carlos Rodriguez, a young man from the Bronx whose path to Meridian Financial had been even more circuitous than Jake's. Carlos had worked his way through community college while supporting his family, then transferred to a state university where he'd excelled despite having to work multiple jobs. He was brilliant and hardworking, but he carried the same uncertainty Jake remembered from his early days in the program. I feel like everyone else here has connections, has advantages I don't have, Carlos confided during one of their weekly meetings. Like I'm always going to be playing catch-up. Jake saw so much of himself in the young man's struggles. Can I tell you something that took me way too long to figure out? Jake said. Your background isn't a disadvantage. It's a different kind of advantage. You see things other people miss because you've experienced parts of life they haven't. That perspective is valuable, but only if you're confident enough to share it. Jake told Carlos about his early fears, about feeling like an imposter, about the moment he realized that his unique experiences were actually assets rather than limitations. He watched as Carlos's posture changed, as uncertainty began to transform into determination. The trick, Jake continued, is learning to translate your experiences into the language of business. You don't have to become someone else. You just have to help other people understand the value of what you bring. Over the following months, Jake watched Carlos flourish, taking on challenging projects and contributing insights that impressed senior management. It was deeply satisfying to see someone else benefit from the kind of encouragement and opportunity that Sarah had given him. Speaking of Sarah, their professional relationship had evolved into something unique and valuable. They maintained appropriate boundaries. She was still his ultimate boss, several levels up the hierarchy, but there was an underlying respect and understanding that dated back to that December night when they'd first really seen each other as human beings. Sometimes, passing in the hallway or sitting in the same meeting, their eyes would meet, and Jake would see a quick smile that reminded him of their dawn conversation about loneliness and ambition and the courage it takes to reach out to another person. Sarah had continued to rise within the company, but she had also made efforts to stay connected to the people whose work made her success possible. She had implemented monthly coffee meetings with employees at all levels, created mentorship programs that paired senior executives with junior staff, and established policies that recognized and rewarded the kind of everyday kindness and excellence that often went unnoticed. The culture at Meridian Financial was changing, becoming more human, more connected, more aware of the individual stories behind the corporate success. One evening in late fall, almost a year after that life-changing December night, Jake was working late when he noticed a light on in Sarah's office. The parallel to their first meeting wasn't lost on him, but this time he didn't hesitate to knock on her door. "Working late again?" he asked, noting the stack of papers on her desk and the tired expression on her face. Sarah looked up and smiled. "Some things never change. But at least this time it's by choice, rather than because I have nowhere else to go." Jake understood the reference to her previous isolation, and he was pleased to hear the subtle indication that her life had become more balanced. "I wanted to thank you," Jake said, "for taking a chance on someone who had no business being in that analyst program." Sarah shook her head. "You're still thinking about this wrong, Jake. I didn't take a chance on you. I recognized something that was already there. The question isn't why I offered you the opportunity. The question is what you did with it once you had it." She gestured to a chair, and Jake sat down, feeling comfortable in this space that had once seemed impossibly foreign to him. "Do you know what the real measure of success is?" Sarah asked. "It's not the title on your business card or the number in your salary. It's whether you become the kind of person who lifts other people up, whether you use whatever power you gain to create opportunities for others." Jake thought about Carlos, about the other young analysts he'd mentored, about the small ways he tried every day to make sure that people felt seen and valued, regardless of their position in the company hierarchy. "I've been watching you this year," Sarah continued, "watching how you treat people, how you solve problems, how you lead by example. You've become exactly the kind of person this company needs more of, someone who succeeds without forgetting where they came from." "I owe you everything," Jake said simply. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "You owe me nothing. What you've accomplished, you've earned through your own hard work and character. What happened between us that night, that was just two people helping each other when they needed it most. The rest has been all you. Wheel. As Jake left her office that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From invisible janitor to respected analyst, from struggling single father to confident professional, from someone who cleaned up after other people's success to someone who was creating his own. But the most important transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. Jake had rediscovered his own worth, his own potential, his own capacity to dream beyond mere survival. He had learned that kindness was not weakness, that vulnerability could be strength, and that sometimes the most important career move you can make is to simply be human when someone else needs you to be. Emma was 9 now, thriving in her new school, proud of her father's achievements, but most importantly, secure in his love and attention. Her heart condition was well managed, her future bright with possibilities that seemed unlimited. She had inherited Jake's empathy and his determination, and she was growing up in a home where hard work and kindness were valued equally. On weekends, Jake and Emma would sometimes walk past the building where he used to work nights, where he used to feel invisible and forgotten. Emma would point up at the 40th floor and say, "That's where Daddy works," with the same pride that other children reserved for astronauts or superheroes. "What do you do there, Daddy?" she asked one Saturday afternoon as they stood on the sidewalk looking up at the gleaming towers of Midtown Manhattan. Jake thought about how to explain it in terms a 9-year-old could understand. "I help people solve problems," he said finally. "I help them see things they might miss, and I try to make sure that when companies make decisions, they think about how those decisions affect all the people who work there. Like making sure everyone feels important." "Exactly like that, sweetheart." Emma nodded seriously. "That's a good job, Daddy." "Yes," Jake agreed, thinking about the journey that had brought him here, about the night when kindness had opened doors he'd never imagined walking through, about the woman who had seen potential where others saw only limitations. "It's a very good job." As they walked home together, father and daughter, Jake realized that success wasn't just about climbing ladders or earning promotions or gaining recognition. Success was about becoming the kind of person who used whatever opportunities they were given to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more fair. It was about remembering that every person has a story, every job has dignity, and every act of kindness has the potential to change lives in ways we might never fully understand. It was about showing up when someone needs you to, even when, especially when, there's nothing in it for you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that kindness comes back to you in ways you never expected, opening doors you didn't even know existed, leading you toward a future that's better than anything you dared to dream. But the real magic isn't in the transformation that kindness creates in your own life. The real magic is in becoming the kind of person who creates that transformation for others, who sees potential where others see limitations, who offers opportunities where others see obstacles, who chooses to lift people up rather than looking the other way. Jake Martinez had learned that the most powerful position you can hold isn't at the top of a corporate hierarchy. It's in the hearts of people whose lives you've touched, whose potential you've recognized, whose dreams you've helped make possible. And that kind of success, that's the kind that lasts forever. In a world that often feels divided between the powerful and the powerless, between those who are seen and those who remain invisible, Jake's story reminds us that the most extraordinary changes often begin with the most ordinary acts of human decency. A willingness to see beyond titles and positions to the person underneath. A choice to offer help without expecting anything in return. A moment of genuine connection between two people who thought they had nothing in common. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply show up when someone needs you to. because you never know when that moment of kindness might change not just their life, but yours as well. And in a world that can feel cold and disconnected, that's a reminder we all need to hear.